The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast sea of sand and rock under a blazing sun that seemed to burn the very air. John Miller, a rugged frontiersman with weathered skin and calloused hands, trudged onward, each step heavier than the last. The weight of the small pack on his back reminded him that he had started this journey with hope and ambition. But now those feelings were fading, replaced by exhaustion and worry. Days had passed since he left the last settlement, and the scarce water he had carried was nearly gone. His stomach ached with hunger, a constant reminder of the supplies that had run out far too soon. John's journey had begun with the promise of silver hidden somewhere deep in the Arizona desert. Prospectors whispered of veins rich and untouched, waiting for someone brave enough to endure the desert's challenges. John had always been brave, maybe even reckless at times, but he had never imagined the desert would be this merciless. The sun rose each day like a golden hammer, beating down on the dry, cracked earth, and the nights brought little relief, the cold cutting through his thin clothing. Despite the hardships, John pressed on, driven by the hope of discovery and the stubborn refusal to give up. Every day in the desert felt the same, yet each day brought new dangers. Loose rocks slid beneath his boots, sharp cactus spines threatened to tear his clothes, and the distant howl of coyotes reminded him that he was not entirely alone. John's mind wandered to the stories he had heard from other travelers. Some had turned back at the first sign of trouble. Others had vanished completely, swallowed by the desert without a trace. He thought of his own life, the family he had left behind, and the dream of finding silver that could change his fortune. But now, hunger gnawed at his resolve, and thirst was a shadow that followed him with every step. By the third day, John's energy was failing. His lips were cracked and dry, and his throat felt like sandpaper. He searched every crevice of rock and every small hollow for a hint of water. Occasionally, he would find a tiny trickle, barely enough to wet his tongue, and he drank it slowly, savoring every drop. He had learned to ration his small supply carefully, but the desert was cunning, and it was slowly taking its toll. His vision blurred at times, and the horizon seemed to stretch further away, as if mocking him. Sleep came in fits, and when it did, it was haunted by dreams of collapsing under the relentless sun. Despite the growing danger, John refused to let despair take over. He reminded himself that he had faced challenges before, though none like this. As a young man, he had crossed wild rivers and scaled dangerous cliffs, relying on his wits and skill. But the desert was different. It demanded patience, resilience, and a humility he was only beginning to understand. The wind carried a dry, stinging heat, and the sand beneath his feet shifted in ways that made each step uncertain. Even so, he pressed on, determined to find the elusive silver, and more importantly, to survive. During one particularly grueling afternoon, John spotted what he thought might be a small depression in the earth ahead. Hope flickered inside him, a small but persistent light. He quickened his pace, his body protesting with every step. As he drew closer, he realized it was a shallow canyon, a place where water might have pooled during the rare desert rains. He lowered himself carefully, scanning the area for any sign of moisture. To his disappointment, it was dry, the rocks baked and cracked, offering no relief. His heart sank, but he refused to let it stop him. Survival depended on perseverance, and John had learned that quitting was never an option. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. John knew he had to find shelter soon. Exposure could be deadly, especially as the temperature would drop sharply after sunset. He scanned the landscape and spotted a cluster of rocks forming a natural alcove. It was small, barely enough for him to lie down, but it would provide some protection from the wind and the sand. Crawling inside, he rested his aching body against the rough stone. Grateful for even this small comfort, he closed his eyes, listening to the silence of the desert, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant calls of animals. Night in the desert was both beautiful and dangerous. The stars emerged in the clear sky, a blanket of diamonds against the deep black. John looked up, feeling a strange mixture of awe and isolation. The desert was alive in ways that were not immediately visible. The creatures of the night moved quietly, unseen but present, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his body shiver. He pulled what little clothing he had closer, trying to conserve warmth, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. Every choice, every step, had led to this moment of vulnerability, yet also to a deep understanding of the desert's unforgiving nature. Morning brought no relief. John awoke with a dry mouth and aching limbs. His water supply had dwindled even further, and his food was gone. He forced himself to drink the smallest sips he could, knowing that every drop counted. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. But thirst was the greater enemy. He searched for any sign of life, any clue that he was not alone in the vast emptiness. Occasionally, a lizard scurried across his path or a bird flew overhead. But these were small comforts in a place that seemed designed to test every ounce of human endurance. Despite the harsh conditions, John's mind remained alert. He examined the rocks, the plants, and the subtle signs of the desert, looking for anything that might sustain him. He remembered stories from seasoned travelers who had survived on roots, berries, and the little water they could find hidden beneath rocks. He began to forage cautiously, digging around the roots of desert plants and examining cacti for any moisture. Each small discovery brought a spark of hope, though nothing was enough to fully replenish his strength. By the fourth day, John's body was weak, and his steps became slower and more uncertain. He could feel his strength fading, and for the first time, fear crept into his thoughts. He was alone, far from any settlement, and the desert showed no mercy. But even in the face of exhaustion, he refused to give up. He remembered the stories of others who had survived, not through strength alone, but through patience, courage, and sometimes, a little luck. His survival depended on continuing, no matter how difficult the path. As the sun reached its peak, the heat intensified. John's shadow seemed to shrink beneath him, the sand reflecting the burning light. He stumbled over a jagged rock, scraping his hands and knees, but pressed on. Every step was an effort, every breath a struggle, yet he continued, driven by instinct and the faint hope that salvation might be just beyond the next ridge. The desert tested him in ways he had never imagined, stripping away comfort and safety, leaving only the raw challenge of survival. And then, just as despair threatened to take hold, he saw it, a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. It was faint, almost imperceptible against the haze of the desert. But it was there, a spark of hope ignited within him. Could it be a settlement, a sign of water, shelter, and safety? With renewed determination, John forced his tired body to move faster, stumbling and crawling when necessary, driven by the desperate hope that he might find someone, anyone, who could help him survive. Every step toward the smoke was a struggle, but John's will was stronger than his exhaustion. He pressed on, knowing that the desert had claimed many lives, but also understanding that persistence could be the difference between life and death. The horizon seemed to shift and change, the rocks forming new patterns, the sand stretching endlessly, yet the smoke remained, a constant beacon in the harsh wilderness. For the first time in days, John allowed himself to believe that he might survive. As he drew closer, he could make out the outline of a small cabin perched on a rocky rise. It was modest, perhaps only a single room, but it represented hope, warmth, and the possibility of nourishment. His heart raced as he approached, each step bringing relief and anxiety in equal measure. He did not know who lived there or if they would help him, but the sight of human habitation was enough to drive him onward. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but the thought of water and food, of rest and safety, gave him the strength to continue. Finally, he reached the cabin. Weak, dehydrated, and hungry, he knocked on the door, unsure if anyone would answer. Moments passed, and then, the door opened slowly. An elderly woman appeared, her eyes sharp yet filled with curiosity. She was small, yet her presence was commanding. And John sensed immediately that she was someone who understood the desert's trials. She looked at him, taking in his emaciated form, the sunburned skin, and the desperate expression on his face. John spoke, his voice weak but earnest, explaining his plight. The woman listened silently, her gaze unwavering. Then, without a word, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. For the first time in days, John felt a wave of relief wash over him. Inside the cabin, away from the scorching sun, he could rest and recover. He did not know her name yet, nor did he understand the full extent of the generosity he was about to receive. But in that moment, he knew that the worst of the desert had not yet claimed him. The cabin's interior was small but welcoming. The air smelled faintly of herbs and smoke, a simple but comforting aroma that made John's stomach ache with hunger all the more. The elderly woman, Nahele, stood silently for a moment, watching him. Her eyes were wise and cautious, revealing the careful life she had led in the desert. She had known hardships and loss. Yet there was a quiet strength in her presence that immediately made John feel both relief and respect. Nahele motioned for John to sit on a low wooden bench. He sank onto it gratefully, his body trembling from exhaustion and dehydration. He was aware of how weak he looked, his clothes tattered from days in the desert. His skin burned red from the relentless sun, every muscle in his body ached, and he felt as though he might collapse at any moment. Yet, there was something about Nahele that made him feel safe, a rare comfort. After the harsh loneliness of the desert, she walked over to a small cupboard and opened it carefully. Inside, there were a few basic items: a small pouch of dried corn, a flask of water, and some roots she had gathered for herself. Nahele looked at John and without a word handed him the flask of water. He took it with shaking hands, bringing it slowly to his parched lips. The liquid was cool and sweet, almost miraculous after the days of dryness he had endured. He drank carefully, savoring every drop as though it were the most precious treasure in the world. Once he had quenched his immediate thirst, John looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and awe. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I don't know what I would have done without this." Nahele simply nodded, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She was a woman who had learned the value of silence and observation. She had seen travelers arrive in worse shape than John, some who did not survive, and she knew that help was often a matter of careful judgment. Giving away too much of her limited supplies could endanger her own survival. Yet she also understood the weight of human need and the kindness that could save a life. She gestured to the pouch of dried corn. "Eat slowly," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "It will give you strength, but not too fast. Your body must adjust." John nodded again, following her instructions. He took a few kernels at a time, chewing carefully, feeling the nourishment seep into his body. It was a slow process, but with each bite, he felt a little more human, a little more alive. He realized then how fragile life could be in the desert, how quickly hunger and thirst could strip away even the strongest person. Every morsel of food, every drop of water, was precious. As he ate, John's eyes roamed around the cabin. It was simple, built from wood and stone, but it was full of small signs of life. There were hand-woven mats on the floor, a few clay pots for cooking, and a shelf with jars of herbs and dried plants. He noticed pictures carved into the walls, scenes of the desert, mountains, and animals, telling stories of a life connected to the land. It was clear that Nahele had lived alone for many years, yet her life was rich in knowledge, culture, and survival skills. After some time, Nahele spoke again. "The desert is not kind to those who wander without care," she said. "It takes what it wants. You were lucky to find this place." John nodded, humbled by her words. He had always thought of himself as capable, experienced in the ways of the wild, but the desert had shown him differently. It had stripped away his confidence and replaced it with a deep respect for nature and the people who had learned to live within its limits. He realized that survival was not just about courage or strength, it was about understanding, patience, and sometimes, the kindness of strangers. Over the next hours, John rested, while Nahali moved quietly around the cabin. She tended to a small fire in the hearth, boiling water for him to drink later, and preparing some of the roots she had gathered. The simple act of watching her work was soothing, a reminder that life could still continue even in the harshest conditions. Her movements were careful and deliberate, each action purposeful, reflecting a lifetime of experience surviving in the desert. John wanted to ask questions about her life, about how she had learned to survive alone. But he also sensed that some stories were meant to be shared slowly. In trust, he watched her, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire and the occasional call of birds outside, feeling a connection that went beyond words. For the first time in days, he felt hope, the belief that he could recover and continue living. By evening, John's strength had returned just enough for him to stand. He followed Nahali outside to fetch some more water from a nearby collection basin she had carefully set up to catch rain. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The air had cooled, and the silence of the desert was now accompanied by the gentle chirping of insects and the distant howl of a coyote. Nahali watched him carefully, offering quiet guidance. She showed him which plants could be eaten in emergencies and which roots contained moisture. She explained how to conserve energy, how to avoid the scorching sun during the hottest hours, and how to move quietly to avoid attracting dangerous animals. Every lesson was a treasure of survival knowledge, passed down from generations who had learned to live in harmony with the harsh desert environment. John listened intently, realizing that this wisdom was more valuable than any silver he had hoped to find. He understood that he was not just being fed and hydrated, he was being taught to survive, to respect the land, and to see it not as an enemy but as a powerful teacher. The realization filled him with gratitude and humility. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Nahali shared more of her life. She had been married once, many years ago, and had known both love and loss. Her husband had died, leaving her alone in the desert, but she had survived through resilience and knowledge. She spoke of the animals, the plants, and the cycles of the desert. And John listened, captivated by the depth of her understanding. She had a quiet strength, the kind that comes from knowing both hardship and how to overcome it. John found himself opening up as well, sharing stories of his life as a frontiersman, of the rivers he had crossed, the mountains he had climbed, and the dangers he had faced. He told her of his dream to find silver, of the ambition that had driven him to risk so much. Nahali listened, nodding occasionally, her expression calm but insightful. She did not judge him, but she offered quiet guidance through her words, helping him see the world differently. Days passed, and with each one, John regained strength. The simple nourishment of corn and roots, combined with water and rest, began to restore his body. His energy returned, and he found himself walking with steadier steps, thinking more clearly, and feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Yet he knew he could not have survived without Nahali's generosity and knowledge. She had given him more than food and water, she had given him life. During this time, John also learned to appreciate the small things in the desert. The patterns of the wind on the sand, the colors of the sunrise, and the quiet presence of animals. He realized that he had been too focused on his quest for silver to notice the beauty around him. The desert was harsh, yes, but it was also alive, and it had its own rhythms and lessons. He began to see the land with new eyes, not as a challenge to conquer, but as a world to respect and understand. By the end of the week, John was strong enough to consider moving on. The desert had tested him, but he had survived. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Nahali, who had saved his life without expecting anything in return. He had come seeking fortune, but he had found something far more valuable: knowledge, humility, and the understanding that survival was as much about the kindness of others as it was about courage. Before he left, John and Nahali sat together one last time. She gave him a small bundle of dried roots and corn to take with him, enough to sustain him for several days. She also shared a few final lessons about reading the land, finding water, and moving carefully through the desert. John listened. Knowing that he carried more than food with him, he carried wisdom, gratitude, and a new respect for life in all its forms. As John walked away from the cabin, he turned once to see Nahele standing at the doorway, watching him go. Her eyes met his, and in that silent exchange, he understood the depth of her generosity and the strength it had taken to survive alone in such a harsh world. The desert stretched ahead of him, still dangerous and unforgiving. But John now felt equipped to face it. He had learned that even in the most desperate situations, survival was possible when knowledge, courage, and human kindness came together. And so, with the first rays of sunlight warming his back, John continued his journey. His steps lighter, his heart stronger, and his spirit forever marked by the quiet heroism of an Apache widow who had given him life when the desert had threatened to take it away. John's days in the desert cabin passed slowly but meaningfully. With each sunrise, he felt his strength returning. And with each sunset, he learned a little more about the harsh yet beautiful land that had tested him so severely. The small portions of dried corn, the careful rationing of water, and the nourishing roots Nahele had shared were working their magic, restoring not only his body but also his spirit. He began to understand that survival was about more than food and water. It was about patience, observation, and respect for the land. Nahele watched him quietly, giving him guidance without unnecessary words. She showed him how to gather small amounts of water from hidden pockets in the rocks, teaching him to look for signs like damp soil or certain plants that grew only near moisture. She demonstrated how to identify edible roots and plants, explaining which could be eaten safely and which could harm a person. Each lesson was a careful gift of knowledge, something that could mean the difference between life and death in the unforgiving desert. John was a quick learner, but he was humbled by the precision and care with which Nahele lived her life. Every action she took was deliberate, reflecting years of experience surviving in a place where one wrong step could be fatal. He realized that he had approached the desert with ambition and courage, but very little understanding. The desert demanded more than courage, it demanded wisdom. And Nahele was a teacher unlike any he had known. As the days passed, John grew stronger, but he also grew more reflective. He thought about his life before the desert, about the places he had been, and the challenges he had faced. He realized how much he had taken for granted. Water had always been plentiful in the towns he had lived in. Food had always been within reach. He had been confident in his abilities, believing that determination alone could carry him through any challenge. But the desert had humbled him, teaching him lessons he would never forget. During one quiet afternoon, as the sun painted the rocks in shades of gold and orange, John sat beside Nahele and asked her about her life. She spoke softly, her voice steady, sharing stories of her youth, the people she had known, and the hardships she had endured. She told him of her husband, who had passed many years ago, leaving her to live alone in the desert. She spoke of the animals, the changing seasons, and the importance of respecting the land. John listened intently, captivated by her calm strength and the depth of her knowledge. In return, John shared stories of his own life, his adventures in the mountains and rivers, and his quest for silver. He spoke of the dangers he had faced, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned along the way. Nahele listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, offering small comments that revealed her wisdom. She did not need to tell him what to think. She guided him through the desert and through his own reflections, helping him see the world differently. As he regained his strength, John began to explore the area around the cabin, still under Nahele's watchful eye. He practiced moving quietly across the rocky terrain, learning to conserve his energy and avoid unnecessary risks. He discovered small signs of life: a lizard scuttling across a sun-baked rock, a bird nesting in a crevice, or tiny insects emerging after the morning frost. Each observation reminded him that the desert, though harsh, was alive and full of lessons if one paid attention. John also learned the importance of preparation. Nahele taught him how to store water in hidden containers, how to preserve roots and dried corn, and how to build small shelters using rocks and branches to protect against the sun and wind. He practiced these skills, realizing that they were not just practical, they were life-saving. The desert could be merciless, but with knowledge, one could survive and even thrive in it. One morning, John awoke to find the sky covered in thick clouds, unusual for this part of the desert. Nahali explained that rain was rare, but when it came, it could change the landscape dramatically. She took him to a small collection basin she had built to catch rainwater, showing him how to clean and store it safely. John marveled at her foresight and ingenuity. She had lived her entire life in the desert, learning to prepare for every eventuality, and she had survived where many others had failed. Over time, John began to notice changes within himself. His body was stronger, his mind sharper, and his spirit more resilient. He had faced the worst the desert could offer and survived, not because of luck, but because of perseverance, intelligence, and the guidance of someone who understood the land intimately. He realized that survival was not just about physical endurance, it was about humility, observation, and learning from those who had come before. During one particularly quiet evening, John and Nahali sat by the fire and watched the stars appear in the clear sky. The desert night was cold, but the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of Nahali made it bearable. John felt a sense of peace he had never experienced in his life before. The desert, which had once seemed like an enemy, now felt like a teacher. He understood that every challenge he had faced had prepared him for this moment, and every hardship had given him the opportunity to grow stronger. Nahali spoke softly about the balance of life in the desert. She explained that the land provided for those who respected it, but it could take away just as easily for those who were careless or arrogant. John listened, absorbing every word, realizing that his previous ambition had blinded him to the lessons of patience and respect. He had come seeking silver, but he was learning something far more valuable: the wisdom to survive and the understanding of the deep connection between humans and nature. As the days turned into weeks, John and Nahali developed a quiet rhythm. He helped with chores around the cabin, gathering firewood, assisting with water collection, and preparing simple meals. In return, she continued to teach him about the desert, sharing stories and survival techniques. Each day brought new lessons, and each lesson made John more capable and confident. He began to see himself not as a lone adventurer but as someone part of a larger world, connected to the land and the people who lived on it. John also began to think about the future. He knew he could not stay with Nahali forever. The desert was vast, and there were still places he had to explore. But he also knew that he had learned something essential about life, something that would guide him wherever he went. He had discovered the value of patience, the importance of careful observation, and the strength that comes from humility and respect. Most importantly, he had learned the power of human kindness. Nahali had given him life when he was at his weakest, and he understood that this act of generosity was rare and precious. One morning, John woke early to find Nahali already outside, tending to the small garden she had cultivated. She had planted a few hardy desert plants, carefully arranged to conserve water and maximize growth. John watched her, marveling at her skill and dedication. She had survived alone in the desert for years, and she had done so not by brute strength, but through knowledge, patience, and respect for the land. Her life was a testament to the power of resilience, and John felt honored to learn from her. As he prepared to leave the cabin, John packed the small bundle of dried corn and roots Nahali had given him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and respect. "I cannot thank you enough," he said. "You have saved my life, and I will never forget it." Nahali nodded, her expression calm but warm. "Remember what you have learned here," she said. "The desert is harsh, but it teaches those who listen. Respect it, and it will guide you. Ignore it, and it will take everything." John promised he would remember. He felt a deep sense of transformation within himself. The desert had tested him, humbled him, and taught him lessons he could never have learned elsewhere. He was no longer just a man seeking silver, he was a man who understood the value of knowledge, patience, and human connection. As he walked away from the cabin, John felt a mixture of excitement and solemnity. The desert still lay ahead, full of challenges and unknown dangers. But he felt prepared to face them. He carried with him not only the physical provisions Nahele had given him, but also the wisdom she had shared. Every step he took was guided by the lessons of survival, observation, and respect. The landscape stretched before him, vast and imposing. Yet John moved with confidence. He had endured hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. And he had survived because of courage, skill, and the generosity of another human being. The desert, once a place of fear and danger, had become a teacher and a partner in his journey. He knew that the lessons he had learned would guide him for the rest of his life. As he climbed a rocky ridge, John paused to look back at the small cabin nestled among the stones. Nahele stood in the doorway, her figure calm and steady against the fading light. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, a recognition of the profound impact she had had on his life. The desert had challenged him, tested him, and changed him, but it had also revealed the quiet heroism and generosity of a woman who had survived alone and taught him how to survive as well. With renewed strength and purpose, John continued his journey through the desert, carrying not just food and water, but wisdom, respect, and a deeper understanding of life itself. The trials he had faced were not forgotten. They were the foundation of his transformation, a testament to the power of human kindness and the lessons that can only be learned in the harshest of circumstances. The morning air was crisp and clear as John prepared to leave the small cabin where he had spent the last several weeks. He had packed the small bundle of dried corn, roots, and herbs Nahele had given him, carefully tying it so that nothing would spill. Every item was precious, not just for nourishment but as a symbol of her generosity and wisdom. His body was stronger now, his movements steadier, and his mind sharper. Yet, as he stood at the doorway, he felt a quiet tug at his heart. Leaving Nahele and the shelter she had provided felt almost like leaving a home he had come to depend on, a sanctuary that had saved his life. Nahele stood silently behind him, her eyes calm and reflective. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that John would eventually continue his journey. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but it was also a place of learning, and she trusted that he had absorbed the lessons she had patiently shared. "Remember," she said softly, "the desert will test you again. Use what you have learned. Respect it, and it will guide you." John nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He had come seeking silver, hoping for wealth and fortune, but he was leaving with something far more valuable: knowledge, strength, and a newfound respect for life and nature. The desert had been harsh, relentless, and unforgiving. Yet it had taught him humility, patience, and the power of human kindness. He felt a mixture of gratitude and determination as he stepped onto the rocky path ahead. As he walked away from the cabin, the sun began to rise higher, casting a warm glow across the desert. The landscape that had once seemed empty and threatening now appeared vibrant and alive. He noticed the small details, the delicate patterns of shadows cast by the rocks, the subtle movement of insects and lizards, and the way the wind carried whispers of the past. Each step reminded him of the lessons Nahele had shared, and he felt a renewed connection to the land around him. The path ahead was still challenging. John had to navigate steep ridges, loose rocks, and shifting sands. The heat would intensify during the day, and the nights would bring cold that cut through clothing. But he moved with confidence, using the skills Nahele had taught him. He knew how to conserve energy, how to locate water, and how to find shelter when needed. Every step was informed by her guidance, every decision a reflection of the wisdom she had shared. As he walked, John reflected on the transformation he had undergone. When he first entered the desert, he had been driven by ambition and the hope of finding silver. He had relied on his physical strength and his confidence, believing that courage alone could carry him through any challenge. But the desert had humbled him. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion had stripped away his arrogance, leaving him vulnerable and reliant on the guidance of another. Through this experience, he had learned that survival was not about force or pride, it was about observation, knowledge, and respect for both nature and the people who understand it. During the journey, John came across small signs of life that he might have ignored before. A tiny trickle of water in a crevice became a source of hope. A patch of edible roots meant sustenance. The tracks of animals told him where to walk safely. These small discoveries, once overlooked, now held great significance. He realized that the desert rewarded careful attention, patience, and respect. It was not a place to conquer but a place to understand. The nights were still cold, and John took shelter in small caves or under rock overhangs. He remembered Nahali's teachings about conserving warmth, creating insulation from sand or rocks, and using minimal energy during the dark hours. He recalled her stories about the desert's unpredictable nature, from sudden storms to hidden dangers, and he applied her guidance with precision. Each night, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that he was surviving not just through endurance, but through the lessons he had learned from her. Days turned into a week as John continued his journey through the desert. His physical strength grew with each passing day, but his spirit grew even stronger. He had learned to appreciate the small victories, finding water, navigating difficult terrain, and identifying edible plants. Each success reminded him of Nahale's careful instruction and the value of her teachings. The desert, once a place of fear, had become a teacher and a partner, guiding him through challenges and revealing the beauty hidden in its harshness. As he walked, John often thought about the kindness Nahale had shown him. She had given him her last supplies, knowing that it might leave her with less to sustain herself. She had shared her knowledge, her home, and her life lessons without asking for anything in return. He realized that true generosity required courage, especially in a place where every resource was precious. Her actions had saved his life, and he knew that he would carry the memory of her kindness forever. The sun rose higher and higher in the sky, and the desert became hotter and more challenging to cross. John reminded himself to rest during the peak hours, finding shaded areas and conserving his energy. He drank small amounts of water carefully, rations he had learned to manage from Nahale's guidance. Hunger was less of an enemy now, as he was able to supplement his food with roots and small desert plants, applying the knowledge she had shared. He marveled at how even the smallest lessons could make such a profound difference in survival. One afternoon, he came across a small canyon where water had pooled from a recent rain. He knelt beside it, cupping the clear liquid in his hands and drinking slowly. The cool water revitalized him, and he paused to rest, reflecting on how far he had come. He remembered the first days of desperation, when even a single sip was a treasure, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for Nahale and the skills she had taught him. Each step forward was now a testament to her guidance and the resilience he had discovered within himself. John also began to notice how much he had changed internally. His ambition to find silver was no longer the driving force of his journey. Instead, he was motivated by a desire to live, to understand, and to respect the desert and its lessons. The physical challenges were still present, but they no longer intimidated him. He felt a sense of harmony with the land, a connection that went beyond survival. He had learned that the desert demanded patience, observation, and humility, and he had grown into someone capable of meeting those demands. As he neared the edge of the desert, where the rocky terrain gave way to more fertile land, John felt a mixture of relief and reflection. The desert had tested him in every possible way through hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and solitude. But it had also given him knowledge, strength, and the rare gift of experiencing human kindness in its purest form. Nahale's generosity had saved his life, and the lessons she had taught him would guide him forever. Before leaving the desert entirely, John paused on a high ridge and looked back at the path he had traveled. The rocks, sand, and sun-baked terrain stretched endlessly, a landscape that had seemed so merciless in the beginning. But now, he saw it differently. The desert was not just a place of danger, it was a teacher, a force that demanded respect and offered lessons to those willing to listen. He felt gratitude, not fear, for the land that had challenged him so deeply. John also thought about Nahele one last time. He pictured her standing in the doorway of her cabin, watching him go. He imagined the strength and courage it took for her to live alone in such a harsh environment, to endure loss, and to still offer her last supplies to someone in need. Her actions had left a lasting impression on him, shaping not only his survival, but his understanding of life and human connection. He knew he would never forget her, and he resolved to honor her lessons by living with respect, patience, and generosity toward others. As he finally left the desert behind, the land around him began to change. Vegetation became more abundant, the air felt cooler and more humid, and the signs of human settlement appeared in the distance. Yet, John carried the desert within him. The lessons he had learned, the value of observation, the importance of patience, the strength found in humility, and the power of human kindness would guide him long after the sun and sand were behind him. John knew that the desert experience had transformed him in ways he could not fully articulate. He had entered it, seeking wealth and adventure. But he was leaving with something far more important: wisdom, resilience, and gratitude. He had survived against tremendous odds, and he had done so with the guidance of someone whose generosity and knowledge were extraordinary. He felt a quiet pride, not in conquering the desert, but in learning from it and emerging stronger and wiser. As he walked toward the distant settlement, John allowed himself a small smile. He had faced hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Yet he had survived. He had learned the value of small victories, the importance of careful observation, and the enduring power of kindness. The desert had not defeated him. It had taught him, and in that teaching, he found not only survival but a deeper understanding of life itself. John Miller stepped out of the desert with a sense of peace, carrying with him the lessons, gratitude, and memories that would stay with him forever. The experience had shaped him into a man who understood that true survival was about more than strength. It was about knowledge, humility, and the rare, life-saving generosity of another human being. And in the quiet of the desert, he had discovered that these lessons were worth far more than any silver or fortune he had once sought.